Thank you, Sonia. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to join the webinar and talk about some of the research from my lab and others that are focused on what we can do for dairy calves in their early life to accommodate their behavioral needs and what implications that might have for their welfare and productivity long term. Okay, so this slide is the take-home message of my talk and also the outline. So I say here that meeting behavioral needs of dairy calves in early life can have long-term animal welfare benefits. So I'm going to divide this talk into two parts. First, what we're actually doing with the calves in early life, what meeting behavioral needs even means, and how we can do that. So essentially, I'll be focusing on some different management approaches to accommodate motivated natural behavior, looking at, as shown in the pictures here, some aspects of social housing, social contact, feeding behavior, and grooming. Okay, so I say this term behavioral needs, and what do I mean by that? So essentially, when we talk about behavioral needs, we're talking about the idea that there are some behaviors that animals are motivated to perform, and they'll attempt to perform the behavior even when certain constraints are imposed. So they might work for access to that opportunity for that behavior, which we can assess using tests of motivation, or they might attempt to perform some partial version of that behavior. So we might see, suckling behavior in calves. If they're not given an outlet for that behavior, we might see it redirected elsewhere. So this idea implies that there's this internal motivation for a behavior. The animal wants to perform it regardless of what resources are available or, whether or not something in their environment is really eliciting it. And when we look at these behaviors, we usually see that there's some benefit for the animal in performing the behavior apart from whatever goal it might be accomplished. So it's not just, a calf is suckling, it's not just that they're obtaining milk, but the suckling in itself is beneficial. So we can think about calves and we can think about what behaviors might meet these criteria. And typically we're talking about those behaviors that are both natural for the species and motivated, that they want to perform that behavior and that they'll work for opportunities to do so. So thinking about what's natural for calves, so we can kind of think about what behaviors cattle evolved performing, what might be important for them. So socially, we look at calves and see that they'll have close contact with the dam in the first weeks, and then they start spending time with other calves. We see behaviors like social play and social grooming. With feeding, we see frequent suckling throughout the day, and then they'll begin to sample and explore some different food sources. And in general, we can think about how the complexity and space that they'll have access to under natural conditions offers opportunities for choice. So, where and how they spend their time, what they're exploring, and we can think about what aspects of this natural picture might be important. Not everything that's natural is good, but some of these natural behaviors might be important for calves that we manage intensively. So first, I'll talk about social contact and specifically how we know it's important, implications of having access to it at all. So thinking about any type of social housing for calves, and then how we provide social contact appropriately. So we know that opportunities for social behavior are going to depend on that type of social contact, space, and complexity of the environment. And in general, I'm not going to dive too much into making a case for how we should consider social housing at all, but I'll be talking about some aspects of it. And I think, just more broadly, I want to say that, there's increasing work that showing that, social housing for calves, at least same age social contact provides some really indisputable benefits. And that's even before we start talking about possible benefits of cow-calf contact, which are going to be beyond the scope of this talk today. But we know that social contact is important from the calf's perspective. Calves will work for access to other calves and tests of motivation, and they'll spend time near familiar calves over time, indicating formation of social bonds. So maybe most simply, if we want calves to have social contact in early life, we can have them in pairs. And I'll be sharing some of our findings with respect to pair housing, including long-term effects later in this talk. But there's been an abundance of research over the past couple of decades supporting benefits of pair housing. I would say that I do not think there to be any particular downsides of pair housing, but we see benefits with respect to behavior, performance, both short and long term. So when we think about pair housing, we've looked a little bit about how this accommodates social behavior. We see formation of preferences for the calves in the same pen. And I'll show a video clip here from a social preference test we did with calves housed in pairs and individually after about 4 weeks of life. So here we looked at pair housed calves that were provided a preference or a choice between their pen mate or a calf from the pen next to them, and then individually has calves that were given the test with the calf from the pen next to them or unfamiliar calf from elsewhere in the barn. And this is what this test looked like. And what we found from the results of this test is that the pair house calves preferred to spend time near their pen mate compared to the calf that had been housed next to them. And they also spent more time with any calf in the pen or in the testing arena compared to individually housed calves, whereas individually housed calves developed no preference for the surrounding calves. So even the one that was from, literally an arm's length next to them in the barn, they didn't seem to prefer spending time near that calf compared to a completely unfamiliar one. So kind of just as a side note, I think it's interesting to make the case that housing with visual contact with other calves is for sure better than no visual contact, but it doesn't seem to actually facilitate the development of anything resembling a social preference or social bond. So that physical contact in the same environment is really important. Okay, so we can look a little bit longer term to make the case that when we provide social contact for calves, that we're actually allowing them to develop bonds, long-term preferences with the familiar animals. And so here's just some data where we looked at calves raised individually or in pairs through the pre-weaning period, and then just post-weaning, they were mixed, commingled between treatments, housed in groups. And then at 5 months of age, we observed them out on pasture to look at social interactions in that group. So we looked at social grooming, we looked at social lying, and then just sort of proximities within one body length of another animal in the pen. And we looked at this a couple different ways, but I'll just give a quick example of a social network based on duration of social lying, so lying within a body length of another heifer in the group. And here, this is what this looks like. The circles indicate individual heifers that were in the pen, and the red ones were those that were previously housed individually, and the blue were those that were previously housed in pairs. And we can look at this kind of social network a couple of different ways. For one, we can look at how many other interactions a heifer had. Here, these circles are scaled to represent social network centrality, or how many interactions that heifer had with other ones, or how long those interactions were. And we didn't see dramatic differences between previously individually and pair-housed heifers. But what we did see is that within these post-weeding mingled groups, that previous pen mates from the pair house treatment were more likely to spend time near their former pen mate. And that's illustrated here for one group with the blue lines between blue circles indicating heifers that had been from the same pre-weaning pair pen. So this suggested that they were spending more time together than would be expected by chance 5 months after they'd been commingled and put out on pasture. And there's also evidence from other groups suggesting that long-term differences into adulthood where proximity and social networks are explained by familiarity between animals. So just one example that something as simple as being housed with just one other animal for the first 8 weeks of life can make a difference in terms of long-term evidence of social bonds between those animals. And so there's been a lot of work looking at pair housing, and it's practical to implement on farm. It's easy to do research with because it's easy to have replicated experimental units. But when we think about social housing on farm, we also see sometimes very big groups. And so this presents some maybe opportunities and challenges when we think about social behavior in calves. And it could make a big difference for the kind of early social experiences a calf has. So on one hand, it's potentially going to introduce some trickier dynamics, competition, for instance, but it also introduces some choices in the environment about how and where calves spend their time, and potentially insight into individual differences. So we were interested in how calves do in those larger social groups, in terms of what kinds of social interactions seem to be important, how they vary over time in response to um, different experiences calves might be having. And one of the first things we did with group house calves, larger groups of calves, was look at social interactions with respect to health status in calves. So when we looked at these larger groups of calves, we've done this time-consuming manual video observations, and we've also looked at location tracking, using ultra-wideband location tracking system to look at just location in the pen and proximity between calves. So we're able to track movements over time and generate this information. Of course, not knowing exactly what the calves are doing when they're near each other, but gives us some insight into proximity-based social interactions across time. And here I'll show some data of how we related these proximity-based social interactions to health status. And we looked at health status a couple different ways. But for one, we looked at used lung ultrasonography to look at subclinical respiratory disease, so evidence of lung consolidation. And here I'll show some of these findings. So this is just an example from 3 of the 10, I believe, pens of calves we enrolled, so groups of 10 calves per pen. And what we found is that across all of the groups we enrolled, that lung consolidation was associated with lower centrality. So here, these graphs are showing the circles, again, represent individual calves, and they're scaled to based on eigenvector centrality, which is a centrality measure that considers the number and duration of those connections, and also the relative centrality of those connections. So kind of factoring in the effect of friends of friends on each node or each calf. And so one thing as a side note that was interesting here is that the nature of the social interactions, the social networks, were really variable across groups. So some groups were just way more social than others. And some of that was explained by group level disease prevalence, which kind of makes sense, because if you're a calf that's in a pen with 9 other sick calves and they are wanting to interact, you're kind of out of luck as far as your opportunities for social interaction. But on the whole, across all the groups, we did see that individual status of lung consolidation did explain reduced centrality. So we started this work, we actually got funding for it right before COVID. And then during COVID, we were out at the farm doing our best to collect this data. You can see the masks on my graduate students here. That was basically predicting that the calves that are sick are going to be showing evidence of social withdrawal, which has been seen in other species the same time that we were all trying to socially isolate. So there is a lot of evidence across social species that social isolation does coincide with disease, and it could be partly based on individuals' sort of separation from the group because they're feeling unwell. There's evidence to suggest that happens in humans, coinciding with some states and also some mental health states. And also it's possible that the healthier cows would be avoiding a sick calf. So we don't necessarily know about the direction of these interactions, just that we see that some variability in social interaction could relate to health status. Okay, so in larger groups of calves, social behavior can also depend on the environment, both the sort of complexity of the environment and the amount of space provided. This is an example of some data where we adjusted the amount of space available in the pen, ranging from kind of industry averages up to a little bit beyond that, to see how it influenced the social interactions and the synchrony and the behavior of calves in the pen. And generally speaking, we saw that when the calves had more space, they were more synchronized in their behavior, which could be interpreted as an indication of their behavior, and there was less constraint placed on it. They typically want to go do things together. They want to rest together, and they were able to do that more readily when they had more space. We also see, based on this sort of motion heat map, increased heterogeneity of space use when they had more space, which kind of makes sense if we think about the the opportunity for where they want to be. It seems like they'd rather spend time near the edge of the pen, and that's most evident when they have that much space to make that choice in. Um, Whereas they kind of tend to use the space more uniformly when there's less. And I should note too that even the largest space allowance we provided for this experiment was still not far beyond what could typically be seen on farm. And there's been the opportunities for social play, for full expression of social play, could easily require much more than this. So in addition to simply just looking at space allowance, we can think about how the complexity of the environment provides opportunities for different kinds of social interactions. And this was a study where we looked at provision of a shelter or a hide in the pen. And initially, we didn't have too much idea about how calves might use this. But our predictions for this experiment were based on, again, the same idea that in states of negative emotional states or sickness or pain might coincide with social withdrawal. And we, again, without knowing exactly what the shelter might provide for calves, we speculated that use of the shelter might be motivated in the same way as social withdrawal is. So the calf would want to be alone and they might use the shelter. So this is what this looked like. We provided it in the pen. We looked at how calves used it over time. And here, this is showing just individual variability and the time spent inside the shelter. And so we've got, this is the clustered bars show 3 consecutive days for each of the different calves we observed. And so on one hand, this is just interesting because we're making the environment more complex. We're giving calves some choices, which could be good for those individuals. Some of them want to use it, some of them don't, just accommodating that individual difference. And it could also be good for us because it's telling us something, maybe, which calves want to be in there or when they want to be in there. The more they have to do, the more potential insight we have into, what can their behavior tell us. And so one of the things that we looked at specifically in this study was how use of the shelter or hide changed following disbudding. And so here we found that the time spent inside this little area increased the day following disbudding, which probably kind of makes sense with coinciding with the local aesthetic analgesia wearing off. And particularly, we saw that the calves were more likely to enter the shelter when it was empty and leave the shelter when another calf was present, suggesting that it may have been actually motivated by social isolation. But we also saw the calves sometimes used it together. So it's not entirely clear, why they may have been benefiting from that space. They could have been wanting to avoid the active pen mates that hadn't been disbudded if they were potentially going to be jostled by them. They could have even been wanting to avoid seeing humans who were walking around the pen, considering that humans had just been in the pen and disbudded them the day before. So we don't know exactly, but it does suggest that something about the choice to use this space might be beneficial. Okay, so I'll talk about feeding behavior a little bit. So kind of just high level for a couple slides, and then I'll give some examples of some work we've done. So first of all, we know that calves are motivated to suckle, and there's oh, there you go. The calves are motivated to suckle, and we know this from a lot of different work. So suckling on its own, apart from actually ingesting milk, has benefits. There's work looking at non-nutritive sucking in calves and humans. It provides benefits in terms of reducing restlessness and heart rate. It has sort of these calming effects, can actually reduce evidence of pain experienced. In calves, of course, it's related to the secretion of hormones related to digestion and satiety. So sucking on its own is important. Foraging also, so calves are motivated to eat hay. You find that we'll actually sort through a mixed diet in favor of the hay. They'll go and eat it from hay nets and feeders, even when they also have it for free. So it suggests this specific motivation for this oral manipulation of the feed. There's also work showing that, young ruminants are motivated to sample and prefer to sample from multiple feed sources. So there's a component of sort of the feed sampling or exploratory behavior that seems to potentially be important and makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint how it could function to inform them about their food choices. Okay, and so when we don't provide opportunities for suckling and foraging, we see that calves try to find kind of a way to do them anyway. So we see an increase in oral behaviors like that pen-directed sucking shown here. And this can be interpreted as the redirected suckling or motivation for oral manipulation, suggesting that aspects of those natural feeding and foraging behaviors are important. So I'll show some data to support this. So here we're looking at the duration of time performing those pen-directed sucking behaviors in 3 different treatments. We had calves fed milk by bucket, we had calves fed milk by bucket and also hay, and calves that were fed milk by a teat and also given hay. And in this study, milk was provided at a rate of 6 liters per day. And you can kind of see how provision of the hay and then the teat and hay both reduced the amount of this behavior, but it also increased across time as the calves got closer to weaning. So for comparison, some similarities here. In this second study, we had group house calves as opposed to individually housed calves. They were given a little bit more milk at 8 liters per day. And the comparison was calves getting a starter only or starter plus hay. And both treatments had milk fed by teat and by an automated milk feeder. So what's interesting here, first of all, is to note the time scale. So the y-axis shows maximum of up to 50 minutes across the observation period. And this was like per 12-hour observation period. On the graph on the left is for an only 8-hour observation period. And so week 4, we can see that these calves are performing this behavior a lot less in the graph on the right. So this could be, it's a different study, but just, descriptively, we could speculate that some of the factors here, the increased milk allowance, even the group housing, are playing into how much the calves are performing this pen-directed sucking. But interesting, during weaning, of course, milk is being reduced, and there's this big increase in how much time we see calves performing pen-directed sucking when they don't have access to hay. But the calves that do have access to hay had much less increase in this behavior. So it's potentially accommodating some of that motivation for oral manipulation. It's in some ways maybe satisfying the reduced opportunity for suckling. Okay, and then I will touch on grooming behavior. There's not as much on this one, but I think it's an interesting one to talk about. So grooming in calves, of course, it depends on access to opportunities to perform the behavior. Lots of opportunities to give calves access to brushes, whether they're the fancier rotating brushes shown here, or even sort of simpler manual brushes. And I think these behaviors are interesting because we see calves do them a lot. And this is just a snapshot of an hour-long period where calves were performing, this is one calf. So the calf's performing a mixture of, using the brush and some social grooming and some self-grooming. And we know from evidence across species that this grooming behavior can be relaxing, can more comfortable, can have some benefits like improving cleanliness. So it might serve some benefits there. And one thing we've seen with brush provision, and this is in the case of just a simple cheap stationary brush shown in the picture here, that providing access to the brush reduced the duration of pen-directed oral behavior. So particularly you can see, this is over the course of the day, that the majority of pen-directed oral behavior coincided with milk feeding or just before milk feeding. But when the calves had a brush, this at 6 a.m. and about 3 p.m. When milk was delivered, provision of a brush reduced that behavior. And it also increased lying time. So it suggests that it might have some calming and relaxation benefits for the calves, that particularly around milk delivery. And then to kind of come back around and tie this into social behavior, we also see that social housing can reduce abnormal oral behavior. So it might have some benefits in reducing stress for calves. So even though we do see here, we've got a comparison of abnormal oral behaviors split between pen-directed, bedding-directed, and then cross-sucking. So even though calves and pairs performed some cross-sucking behavior, um, wasn't a lot. And on the whole, we saw that they performed less of any type of abnormal oral behavior overall. So again, suggests some benefits of social housing, as well as other aspects of environmental complexity in the development of abnormal oral behaviors. Okay, so we'll move to sort of this idea of potentially this accommodating these behavioral needs in early life could have long-term welfare benefits. So I've kind of hopefully partially made the point anyway that when we see the behaviors that calves are motivated to perform in early life, how we can try to improve their welfare during that early life window. But here we want to try to think about how that might matter beyond the pre-weaning period. And so to kind of assess the longer term implications of these early life behavioral opportunities, kind of maybe makes sense to dig into this concept of animal welfare more. So here's a definition of positive animal welfare, just put forward as part of the collaborative European effort to advance consideration of positive animal welfare. And so they write that positive animal welfare is defined as the animal flourishing through the experience of predominantly positive mental states and the development of competence and resilience. And I wanted to put emphasis on this development of competence and resilience piece. So we can think about competence in terms of specific behaviors. So first of all, early life experience might be providing the calf the opportunity to better develop foraging skills or social ability. You could think, for example, about how in socially housed calves, we see increased ability to cope with competition for access to a resource, so they're more successful in accessing a resource when faced with competition. And we can also think more generally about competence in learning or ability to learn, which can be influenced by prior experiences. And then resilience refers to this bouncing back from challenges. So when you think about the kind of challenges that dairy cattle are going to experience, regrouping, housing changes, other management changes, their ability to cope with that could depend in part on competence, behavioral and cognitive abilities, and also more generally how they cope with novel environments, how fearful they are, and all of those things can be subject to previous experience. And we think about social isolation, evidence across species supports how that social isolation can have long-term effects on anxiety and fearfulness. And then with respect to social housing, we can also think about how that early social experience and opportunity to form social bonds that I talked about earlier could have indirect effects on resilience. So if we think about the animals that longer term may have closer social relationships, they then may be more equipped to benefit from social support during a challenge that would allow them to have better resilience. Okay, so despite having just said something about long-term effects, I'll illustrate these ideas first with some short-term data. So this is some results from a study we did a couple years ago, where we wanted to see what effect pair versus individual housing might have on calves when we're only looking at the first couple of weeks before the calf goes into group housing. So I've seen that it's fairly common for calves that will be eventually group housed to be isolated for at least a couple of days, if not a week or so, before they're put into the group. Benefits possibly of controlling hygiene, allowing for individual monitoring before the calf then goes, say, into a group with an auto feeder. But we also know that social contact can be so important from birth if we look across species. So we looked here at manipulating the degree of social contact before they're then put into the group. And at initial grouping and regrouping, we saw that calves that had been housed in pairs before being put in the group pen had more social interactions with other calves, and particularly their former pen mate. They spent a lot of time lying socially with their former pen mate when they were first put in the group pen, the majority of their lying time really, whereas calves that had been previously housed individually spent much more time lying alone. And then after regrouping, this difference in degree of social lying was reduced, but we also saw that previously pair-housed calves spent more time lying total, so could suggest that they had increased ability to cope with this change or increased resilience as a result of their prior social experience. We also looked at some effects of prior social contact on response to novelty. So after the calves had been in groups for 2 weeks, we did a couple different behavioral tests. One of them shown here is response to a novel object. And we looked at some different responses to these tests, but the results shown indicate a partial result from the principal component analysis that suggested that calves that had been previously housed in pairs were more willing to approach the novel object. They approached it more quickly. They spent less time or more time in contact with it, suggesting that they may have been less reactive to this novel environment, less fearful. Or potentially more exploratory. So this suggests that sort of more generalized benefit of early social contact on the response to novelty. And this has been shown in other species in the longer term effects consistent with this as well. Okay, I'm going to also look specifically at cognition, and this is there's a lot of evidence to support cross species that early environmental complexity improves learning ability in different ways. And in calves specifically, there's been some work showing that social housing can improve reversal learning ability or indications of behavioral flexibility. And a couple studies showing that also enrichment, so aspects of physical enrichment and hay provision can improve different types of learning. So again, all of this can contribute to some of those long-term possibility of improved welfare. Okay, so I'll end by actually discussing long-term effects. So hopefully I've at least made the case that this early experience could potentially have long-term implications for animal welfare. Of course, doing those studies is the hard part. So I've got a little bit of evidence to back this up. This will be focused on social housing. And here we looked at calves raised at different types of housing during the pre-weaning period and followed them into adulthood. So we know they're going to experience all sorts of challenges as they develop. And one of the focal points we looked at was introduction to the freestall. And this provides a challenge in a couple of ways. So for one, we're just regrouping them, and we know that's going to disrupt their behavior and reduce rest and increase agonistic behavior like competition. In this case, they're also being put into a new housing environment. So that novelty is also a challenge. And so what we found is that when we compared previously pair-housed and individually housed heifers, like during the pre-weaning period, when we then put them into the freestall at about a month prior to their expected calving date, we saw that previously pair-housed heifers, they spent more time eating, had more frequent meals. They spent more time walking around the pen. They spent less time using the stall, but they had no difference in lying time. So they were spending less time just like standing idle in the stall. And they had less frequent displacements from the stall. So overall suggests that they maybe had an easier time when they were moved into the freestall for the first time. And we also saw that these differences were essentially exacerbated at high stocking density. We couldn't control stocking density in this study, so we considered it in our analysis in interaction with treatment effects. And we've got some effects shown here where we can see that at higher stocking density, individually housed heifers were more affected than pair housed. So here for stall use, at high stocking density, individually housed heifers show changes in behavior that are consistent with competition for access to a resource, where they'll access it less frequently and spend more time when they do access it, which is consistent with different types of competition for different resources. And we also similarly saw greater changes in behavior in terms of feeding at higher stocking density. So suggesting that, again, the previous individually housed heifers were more sensitive to stocking density. They had a harder time adapting to that transition to the freestall barn. And just quickly, I wanted to mention that we similarly saw when we included some group housed heifers, so heifers that have been raised in groups of 10, we looked at behavior as well right preceding calving. We saw some similar effects where on the left that individually housed heifers were more affected by stocking density. There's no overall treatment effect here, but there was an interaction with stocking density where only individually housed heifers were affected by stocking density with respect to social lying time, which might suggest that they had less ability to, make choices or control how much they were spending time resting the other heifers. We also looked at how much time passed between the last meal and calving, and we saw, again, at high stocking density, that individually housed heifers went longer without accessing the feed bunk before they had their calf, suggesting that they may be more sensitive to competition than the other socially reared heifers. Okay, and then finally, just a couple of notes of some preliminary long-term data looking at production to the first lactation. So kind of up to this point, I've talked about some of these early life differences, some longer term differences in social ability and resilience to competition. We also saw there were some long-term differences in growth that didn't explain the behavioral differences we saw when included in the model. But again, all of this kind of pointing to cumulative benefits of early life social contact that could potentially translate into benefits from milk yield. So we looked through first lactation for heifers that had been raised in individual pens, pairs, or groups of 10. We had 50 focal heifers from these different housing treatments that made it through to the lactation that we had complete data sets for. And we saw this effect where both pair and group housed heifers produced more milk, particularly early in the lactation compared to heifers that had been raised individually. And I'm showing a simplified version of this analysis here. We also included effects of season and a handful of other measures related to age at calving and body weight. And we've got a suggestion here that social housing resulted in long-term benefits for milk yield, as well as body weight that we're not fully explaining the benefits for milk yield. So definitely supporting this idea that the combination of benefits, both behavioral and in terms of growth, development, and performance attributed to social housing, can result in benefits that are apparent into lactation. And then I'll end with something a little bit more out there, I guess. Group housed heifers within their group experience, like I said, a lot of variability in what their experience could be. And I mentioned earlier some differences in how much social interaction they have within their group. Some of them are more social than others. That could relate to things like health, to growth. And in some more preliminary data, when we looked at the degree of social connectedness of those heifers with that group, we found that it also predicted first lactation milk yield. So on this graph, I'm showing the blue dot represents heifers that were relatively more social, and red dots represent those that were relatively less social across the weeks of lactation. And this is just stratified into high and low, but we looked at this as a continuous predictor of milk yield. And I found it positively predicted first lactation milk yield as well. So it again suggests that actual social experience, how social they are within the group, may predict longer term ability to cope with stressors potentially, to access feed, and something that translates to increased milk yield. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. And I'll just end with some ideas of, where do we go here? What future work's going to look like? So I've mentioned a couple different examples of things that we can look at in fairly conventionally managed calves as far as social housing and feeding. But of course, what might actually be sufficient to meet calf's behavioral needs is still, I think, up for debate. And one thing that has come out of this work so far that really interests me is looking at individual differences. So how we might accommodate them through choices and complexity in early life, and what those individual differences might tell us about those animals and their longer term welfare. And then, of course, I've only given a couple examples of some preliminary insight into long-term welfare implications of early life. This is an area that it's tricky to research, but for sure needs more attention to really link some of these long-term welfare implications with things that we can provide for calves in early life. Thank you very much.